Welcome to the dedication program for the Robert LaFollette Residence Halls. The halls that we are dedicating today gives approximately 1,935 more graduate and undergraduate students an opportunity to live on campus and attend Ball State University. We at Ball State firmly believe that a student's out-of-class experiences are important and meaningful. These halls, with 9 professional directors and a strong student staff, will provide the supportive environment where college students can begin to accept the responsibilities of young adulthood. At this time, I would like to call your attention to the faculty for whom the halls are named and their immediate families who are seated in the front of the auditorium. Mrs. Robert LaFollette, Miss Margaret Brayton, Mrs. Gola Clevenger, Mr. and Mrs. P.D. Edwards, Mr. Lawrence Hurst, Dr. Halleck Knotts, Miss Lucia Mish, Dr. John Shales, Dr. Shively and his wife, and Miss Grace Woody. Could we ask them to stand so that we can recognize them by our applause? Would you stand, please? Thank you. I would also like to introduce the members of our University Board of Trustees. Mr. and Mrs. Alex Bracken, President, Mr. and Mrs. George Stevens, and Miss Thelma Ballard. Would you stand so we could give you our recognition? Thank you. Now I would like to present Dr. John R. Emmons, President of Ball State University, who will make the dedication statement for the university.
Thank you, Jack, Mr. Severide, members of the Board of Trustees, honored emeriti, and your relatives and friends, and Ball Staters and friends of Ball State. It is a very real pleasure again to welcome a group to a dedication program, and we're honored by the presence of those people for whom we are naming the buildings and for their relatives and friends who came to be with them on this interesting occasion. This is an occasion on which we memorialize members of our emeritus group. It's another red letter day at Ball State, and it's a part of our 50th anniversary program also. And we meet for the dedication of the largest residence hall that we've had on the campus. Dr. Breyer has already told you 1,900 students, more than 1,900. The program for the evening is planned in 3 parts. First, we want to tell you something about the Robert R. LaFollette Halls, the traditions and the purposes and the plan. Then you are to hear a speaker with an international reputation whose presentation is appropriately related to the activities of Dr. LaFollette. And of course, his remarks will be of immense concern to all of us today in the international realm. Third, and later this evening, after the program is concluded here, we are all invited to the open houses to see the 9 different residence halls in the Robert LaFollette complex. Well then, for the first part of the first part, it's my privilege to talk with you a little about this unique residence hall. It's a different building. In 1965, we needed to have a residence hall coming along each year, 1966, 1967, 1968, or 67, 68, and 69. And so we designed the building that could be built as a continuous unit, consuming 3-year period. But fortunately for us, it was actually completed in a 2-year period. This saved us money, and it also provided space earlier than we had expected to get it. Secondly, this large building has some other unique features, unique to our residence halls. There is a special residence unit for graduate students. And when the building is finally completed, it will have a special snack bar and study space for commuters who park, as you know probably, out to that end of the campus. And in addition, they will have several classrooms. This will be our first, what we call, living and learning program in a residence hall. Now, this complex, as we've already said, houses approximately 2,000 students, but it's constructed in units of 200, each with a professional director and with student help, the same as all of the other residence halls on the campus. And now it's quite appropriate, it seems to us, as a part of our tradition at Ball State, that we honor our emeriti, those who have honored the college by their service and leadership for a good many years. We frequently say that our emeriti, some of those who were here in what we call in quotes the early days, and some of them are still here, they laid the foundation, the solid foundation, based on excellent teaching, on recognition of the worth of the individual, and on loyal service, the foundation which makes possible what we now call the superstructure that we are developing. The individuals that we recognize have already been named, but let me just remind you. Dr. Robert LaFollette, 40 years at Ball State University, in the history department and head of the Department of Social Science. Miss Margaret Brayton was at the Burroughs Laboratory School from 1932 to 1962. Gola Clevenger, placement, 1924 to 56. Dr. P.D. Edwards in the math department and head of it a part of the time from 1926 to 62. Mr. Lawrence Hurst, social science, 1926 to 1950. Miss Lucille Knotts in the Burroughs Laboratory School in English, 1929 to 53. Lucia Mish in art, 1934 to 63. Dr. John Shales, professor of education, 1929 to 1960. Dr. Levi Shively, mathematics, 1928 to 51. And Grace Woody from 1924 to 61. I read those numbers because I think it's interesting to know that these 10 people served this university a total of 306 years. Now, as a part of the tradition, we have now named on this campus 28 residence halls for faculty and staff members who have served the university for long years with dedication and loyalty. And with the completion of the Johnson halls, which are now under construction, we will have so honored 40 of the early, in quotes, stalwarts, and their names will be perpetuated in buildings on this campus. It's our hope and our expectation that the young men and the young women who live in these buildings in 1968 and 78 and in the year 2000 shall, by following the examples provided by the naming of these halls, make their contributions to the development and the expansion of Ball State University in the years to come. This is the tradition. We reach back into the past, we talk about the present, we look to the future. In the continuity, this is the university. Thanks for listening to me.
Thank you, President Emmons. Now I would like to present Mr. Kenneth Sigmund, who resides in Hearst Hall as part of the LaFollette complex. He's also a member of Phi Gamma Mu, the honorary social science fraternity, and this honorary was established by Dr. LaFollette. May I present Mr. Sigmund, who will make the student acknowledgement.
Surely all of us here realize that one of the most important facets of a college education is learning to know and appreciate others, both like and unlike oneself. Probably one of the most important places in which this learning occurs is the residence hall. The hall provides a student the opportunity to interact daily with people of different races, religions, mores, and from different social and economic backgrounds. In this respect, a residence hall can be considered symbolic of the life of Dr. LaFollette, a man who truly appreciated the differences in people and spent much of his life working to upgrade the educational systems of developing nations. The actual physical facilities in a hall may affect to a large degree the interaction which takes place there. As a resident of the LaFollette complex, I would like to say that I feel we are very fortunate in having such a fine building in which to learn and grow. Every day one can see the residents of the 9 LaFollette halls meeting, talking, and broadening their own personal experiences by sharing them with others. In the dining rooms, the lounges, the hallways, and in the students' individual rooms, this interchange occurs daily, and it is through this interchange that we students begin to crystallize our own personal beliefs. It is through these personal encounters that we hope to transform our factual knowledge into wisdom. On behalf of the 1,800 residents of the LaFollette complex, may I express the thanks and appreciation which we all feel for having been provided the opportunity to enrich our formal education in such a fine new building.
Thank you, Kenneth. Now I would like to present Dr. John Hannaford. Dr. Hannaford succeeded Dr. LaFollette as chairman of the Social Science Department. He is now designated as head of the Economics Department. Dr. Hannaford will introduce our honored speaker.
I find a particularly appropriateness in this moment because as a student of Robert LaFollette and as a staff member of his over the years, I often heard him mention with favor the analyses of Mr. Eric Sevareid. In nearly 40 years as a newsman, Mr. Eric Sevareid has performed with distinction nearly every specialized editorial task the Fourth Estate requires. The whole world, in war and peace, has been his beat for nearly 4 decades. From his biographical data, I count a total of 16 national and international awards Mr. Sevareid has received for excellence in his profession, plus 3 honorary degrees from colleges and universities. In between times, he has written 7 books, the first one at the age of 18. Interpreting the flood tide of the day's news in a democracy is an awesome responsibility. The discharge of that responsibility is properly reserved for our rarest intellects. Among the small band who are equal to the task by the agreement of thinking people is our speaker of the evening. We are particularly honored to have Mr. Eric Sevareid speaking to us on the President, the Power, and the Peace. Mr. Sevareid.
Mr. Chairman, Dr. Hannaford, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for that introduction, sir. It made me feel quite cosmic, I must say. I don't know if I can live up to that. But you're good to have me here. I'd not been to Muncie before in all my considerable travels, and I'm very honored you would have me as part of the observance of what I know is a very considerable milestone in the history of this university. I think the last time I was in Indiana was doing some political reporting. Maybe it's just as well I'm here now before the Holocaust of May 7th, because the place may not look the same. The last time I was here a good many years ago in some political reporting, and I was assured then that really Indiana was politics in a way, and that it was a very firm legend in this state that the first intelligible spoken words of any male baby born in Indiana were, I am not a candidate for public office, but so many of my friends have urged me, etc., etc. So I firmly expect you to put on quite a show on the 7th of May. You'll be crawling with Washington experts, so-called. You may not recognize what has happened when you read their stuff, but it's going to be very fascinating for everybody concerned. Now, I wanted to talk on rather serious things tonight. There's no gossip in this speech, no inside stories, not even a joke. And I know I don't have to tell anybody here that this is a critical period in the collective affairs of the American people. Critical, but not to my mind really fateful. I don't think we're poised at any Rubicon. I think these difficulties are about as deep and serious as any since Lincoln's time. But I'm not one of those who believes that this nation is about to be torn apart or our system of government torn down. We are living now in a state of intellectual disunion, in an emotional state that has become rather disbelieving and tinged here and there with a kind of moral anarchy, chiefly among a minority of the young and a minority of Negro Americans. But those who proclaim in apocalyptic fashion that we are a sick society, I must say, see this country through very different lenses from mine. Edmund Burke said that he knew of no way of drawing an indictment against a whole people. So I don't believe in mass guilt either. If everyone is guilty, then no one is guilty. But if there is such a thing as mass guilt, then of course there would have to be such a thing as mass punishment. And that's beyond the thought or the means of a democracy if it wants to remain a democracy. That's basically very healthy American society is trying rather desperately and cumbersomely, with many false starts, to cleanse itself of the one serious chronic virus in its bloodstream, which is racism, and all that that has brought about. And if the hour is late, perhaps because the rate of expectations has increased by geometric proportion in this generation, it has speeded up, not really because the conditions of those at the bottom became intolerable in comparison with what they had been before, but because they became intolerable in contrast with the increasingly better life for those not at the bottom, and in contrast with the new promises and the new hopes. The Negro passion, I think one might call it, of our day, seems to be the closest thing to a true people's revolution that this country has experienced. But it has followed the historic pattern in which revolutions do not produce change in the first instance. Instead, change produces the revolution, which then continues it. Inert, weary, hopeless, totally downtrodden masses of people do not make revolutions. They are generally made by a small minority of intellectuals in a general social atmosphere of intellectual freedom, not of intellectual repression, and they gather strength when changes have been made, like the historic Supreme Court decision on school desegregation. When light is seen at the end of a long dark tunnel, that is when hope is aroused. And this, of course, is why dictatorships of left or right keep their sharpest eye on the intellectual community and what is taught, printed, broadcast, and acted, spoken on the stage or in films. Periods of great freedom of speech are the periods of great change. And never in our history has there been such freedom of expression as there is today. Never such concern with the downtrodden by the so-called establishment. Never such concern for defendants by police and court authority. I know this will sound a little strange and maybe a little offensive even to many who are young. I think that is because youth can measure in only one direction, from things as they are forward to their ideal of what things ought to be. They cannot measure backward to things as they used to be because they've not lived long enough, and they cannot measure laterally to the condition of other societies on this earth because they've not yet had the opportunity to know those places very well. And this, I would suggest, is the core reason why the so-called generational gap in viewpoint exists and why it will always exist. It's not our freedom that is in jeopardy in the first instance. It is order and the capacity of our institutions to deal with our pressing problems. And if they are pressing very painfully now, It's not really because of venality in high places or ignorance or because of apathy and indifference by the much abused middle class. It's because in a relatively short period, we've had a demographic revolution with tens of millions of people pouring into the cities, a new scientific industrial revolution which rapidly alters our daily lives, a communications revolution which has intimately brought every condition and problem into everyone's ken, and an educational revolution which has made some measure of learning all but universal, and which has thus encouraged extra millions of people to wish to play some role in the articulation of or the solution of these problems. Mass education and intimate mass communications, one almost obliged to suggest, maybe turning us in a way in the direction of direct democracy. I think the ancient Greeks believed that a citizenry of about 5,000 people was the manageable maximum for direct democracy. We'll see how it goes with around 100 million taking part. What I'm trying to suggest here is that public indifference to public affairs is not the real problem, that the problem rather is of an opposite nature. But the leadership of this multifarious society, in a strange way, comes down to the nature of one man, the one in the White House. President Johnson now has a new lease on political authority, in the very process of giving it up, and I pray that he may do something with it. He was undone by two things. He continued and magnified a blunder in Asia, and he could not communicate to his people at home. The latter he is well aware of, he is often talked about in private. Let me put it this way. He's been a great indoor president and a poor outdoor president. Among friends, in private, he can be witty and warm, indeed charming and very convincing. He was not able to manage that in public. His most effective techniques were those of an essentially private nature. For 30 years, those were the reflexes he developed in the work of Capitol Hill, the personal persuasion of individuals. He never really had to relate to the public at large, and he never really learned how. So trust broke down between him and too many citizens. Woodrow Wilson once said that a president whom the people trust can not only lead them, but he can form them to his own views. I have no idea who Mr. Johnson's successor will be. I would pray that he is one who can restore this element of trust, and for this the capacity to communicate will be essential. Mr. Johnson has been trapped by the Vietnam War, and he is now trying to break out of this. It is much easier to get into a war than to get out of one, much easier to build one up than to build one down in the face of a strong, determined enemy, and many traps and disappointments lie ahead. I don't expect genuine peace in Vietnam for a long time yet, but the general direction the President is trying to take, I think, is the only one possible for a civilized people. The war in the overall, I think, is essentially a stalemated war and has been for a long time. That implies a compromise settlement, however long it lasts. The only effective way to have gone in the opposite direction would be to aim for total destruction, north and south, or for total occupation of the South with something like 1.5 million American troops for years to come. I'm sure the American people would not tolerate either solution. Now, this is not all in its effects on us at home entirely new. Politically and morally, there are at least two fairly close parallels to this condition. One was the war against the Filipino insurrectionists at the turn of the century. The other was the war against Mexico 120 years ago. As both divided this country, both set much of the educated community against Presidents McKinley and Polk, both produced localized rebellions against military service, both cost some politicians their positions, most notably Congressman Abraham Lincoln in the Mexican War. In both affairs, millions of Americans felt that their country was behaving foolishly and indeed immorally. All his later life, Ulysses S. Grant regretted his part in the Mexican War, which he regarded as illegal and immoral. Tom Reed, perhaps the greatest Speaker of the House we ever had, quit politics forever over the conquest of the Philippines. So whatever you may think about them, in other terms, the Fulbrights or indeed the Dr. Spocks are not outside the American tradition. A fundamental debate today about a course of action when that action is war, no doubt is more dangerous than it was in 1900 or in 1847, when we were not a superpower in this world and when we could enjoy the special freedoms of the weak. But the greater danger would be to flinch from this argument. And were there no protests at all about this war, then I think we should have very serious cause to worry about this society. In any case, I'm not so sure it's so late in the day. Maybe much earlier than we think. The story of our violent involvement with Asia may possibly be in just an early stage. I think I am objective about this war, but I don't feel neutral about it. I've concluded for the last 2 or 2.5 years that it really was not necessary. I know there are many people who say that with almost an air of pleasure. I must say I find it painful. Our young countrymen are being killed there. Friends of mine have died there, sons of friends. One of your great men from your university also has died there. I have a brother there now in the army. But nevertheless, I'd have to say that I think it was never necessary to have transformed what was a localized civil war of a guerrilla type into a major international war, producing not only great suffering, but the possible seeds of a bigger war. Not necessary to make all Southeast Asia stiff with weaponry in order to achieve a balance of power with Communist China, which is apparently the ultimate purpose of this involvement. I don't think myself that our national security was vitally involved in Vietnam, and I'm not persuaded that our military presence in Southeast Asia will produce stability in that region. It's quite as likely to produce a constant exacerbation of the area, an endless and dangerous tension. I don't think that even if Ho Chi Minh had taken all of Vietnam after 1954, that would have equated with the extension of Chinese power through that region. I don't follow this domino theory very far. Quite possibly Laos, perhaps Cambodia, would have fallen like dominoes to communists, though not necessarily to China, but I would doubt that Thailand or Burma or Malaysia or Indonesia are dominoes. They're much more like sponges, in my impression of them. Their edges can be saturated with communist-inspired, anti-central government subversive movements, but there are many natural obstacles to this water seeping through the whole organism, and among them, of course, the historic distrust and dislike of the Chinese. And these border disturbances under various names have been endemic for generations. So I haven't really been able to accept the administration rationale, which has developed in stages ex post facto to justify this enormous intervention. The Eisenhower and Kennedy commitments to Vietnam did not bind us to this scale of intervention. Although the Kennedy escalation made it very difficult to reverse gears, the CETO Treaty does not bind us, nor does a congressional resolution passed under the President's pressure during the excitement over the Tonkin Bay gunboat episode, the facts of which are still somewhat obscure, at least debated. The truth is that we got into this dilemma step by step, walking backwards, steadily escalating because we did not know what else to do at the time. And for the most part, and most of the time, we have been fighting a war of attrition against Asians in Asia, something most of us never dreamt would ever happen to us. Most of the fighting has not been acquiring valuable real estate or freeing cities or large numbers of people or denying vital resources to the enemy. Most of the big fighting has been in uninhabited, or almost uninhabited regions. It's been a little like two teams of gladiators clashing every day in an empty arena, and at the end of each day counting to see which side has the most men still on their feet. But I had no wish to spend this whole period tonight talking directly about Vietnam. I really wanted to talk about the historical setting in which this thing has occurred and which permitted it to occur, to try to identify what hour this is on history's political clock and the locale of our country in this globe. It just happens to be Vietnam that has forced and has focused this larger debate and obliged us to take a fresh look at the fundamental foreign policies of our own country. This look is being attempted in a number of universities, many foreign policy study groups at certain levels, not very high levels in the administration, and the Congress has made rather feeble stabs at it. Perhaps the atmosphere of the capital is now so heated up that any cool and fresh reappraisal may not be possible, but I think this has to come somehow, sometime, or we may be in for more bitter disappointments. So I want to advance a few notions here, not all of them by any means original with me. Now, to begin with, a nation's quality, great or otherwise, does not grow out of its foreign policy. What foreign policy does, if it's wisely considered, is to provide the margin of safety in which a nation can develop the inherent quality of its own society. We misapply what I take to be the existentialist faith to foreign policy. We seem to believe that if we do not act in the world, we do not exist in the world. But often enough, it seems to me, it's our simple existence as successful and peaceably inclined people that exerts more influence abroad than our specific acts. If Castro's power does not, after all, spread widely in Latin America, it's not so much because we have supplied arms in support to this regime or that one, probably more because of our simple existence, our palpable weight as a contrary influence, as an alternative, as a present or potential ally. And those people, like some, I would say, in the CIA and other places, who seem to want constantly to get arms into the hands of almost any group that calls itself anti-communist, I think have a very mechanistic view of world affairs. There's often a good deal to be said for what British diplomats used to call masterly inactivity. Let me use a rather top-lofty analogy and put it this way. Our fundamental trouble as a nation in the world is that we don't know what Archimedes knew. You remember that the ancient Greek mathematician and inventor with his pulleys and his levers said that he could move the world if he had a place to stand. He knew he did not. He knew his feet had no separate foundation, that he was in and of the world. Sometimes we Americans, or many of our leaders at any rate, don't seem to have a very keen sense of this, and we seem to think we do stand in a separate place. And perhaps that's why we talk about conquering nature or conquering space. But we are of nature, and we are in space, and we are surely in and of this world of nations. We are bigger, we are richer, we're more powerful than others, but perhaps no wiser, no more noble, scarcely less prone to prejudice and fears and angers, and therefore to mistakes. John Adams said once that power always thinks it has a great soul and vast views beyond the comprehension of the weak. Now, the spirit of our prevailing foreign policies springs really from our 19th century experience and psychology. We still believe, because of our internal continental experience, that human problems, even the centuries-old problems of very alien nations, can be solved, whereas Europeans generally assume they can be ameliorated only. If you can do that, you're living successfully. We believe that alien societies can be developed or renovated through the same political and economic processes and institutions that worked for us as we developed this continent in isolation and safety. We believe not only that progress is real, not just material, but moral progress, but that human happiness is attainable, and that we can help the most remote and alien civilizations attain it if only we adopt the right policies. Now, this modern interventionism, this globalism, as some historians have pointed out, is the other side of the coin of isolationism. Both attitudes are based on the concept of America as the last best hope of earth, the final headquarters of goodness, the ultimate sanctuary of man's ancient dreams. The old isolationist said, "Let us preserve this specialness by removing it from the world's contamination." And the new interventionists say, "Let us preserve this specialness by stopping forces of darkness and aggression everywhere in the world before these forces sweep over us too." The view of America seems essentially the same. Now, President Johnson and Secretary Rusk, Mr. Walt Rostow, who writes many of their speeches, are still talking, it seems to me, with Theodore Roosevelt of the white man's burden and manifest destiny, with Woodrow Wilson of making the world safe for democracy, or as Wilson once said, teaching Latin Americans to elect good men. They're still saying these things, except the phraseology has changed. Now the phrases are such as these: freedom versus unfreedom, the struggle for the uncommitted world, closing the gap between the rich nations and the poor nations, the creation of a world order, and more recently, the end of poverty in Asia. We have not been able to end poverty in the Philippines, or come anywhere close to it, where we've been the dominant foreign influence for about 68 years, and we've already spent tens of billions of dollars. A country whose free political institutions, and my own personal guess, have not very much longer to live. We haven't been able to end poverty in Harlem, New York, or in Northwest Washington, D.C. But these statements I've cited reflect certain deeply embedded concepts which some of our leaders assume to be eternally and universally true. For example, the idea that all peoples are able to choose between freedom and unfreedom, that is, democratic social institutions or some form of directed government. But this is not true in many places. In Vietnam itself, I would think, or in a place like Nigeria. In such places, the real choice is between some kind of order, almost any kind, and anarchy. Woodrow Wilson, I think, made more philosophical sense about all this when he was a professor than later when he was under the pressures and the visions of the presidency. And he wrote once that self-government is not a mere form of institutions to be had when desired, if only proper pains be taken. It is a form of character. It follows upon the long discipline which gives a people the habit of order and peace and common counsel, and a reverence for law which will not fail when they themselves become the makers of law. But this form of character, if that is the right word, exists in only rather few places in this world, and we always miss Wilson's point. The people that both governments and the press usually send to foreign areas are trained in history, economics, political science, people like me, for example. Rather few are trained in comparative religions, world literatures, anthropology, psychology. And they see each foreign people through the prism of their own special training. Only the very occasional psychologist and anthropologist, for example, guessed at what would happen in the Congo in 1960. You may recall that in the weeks preceding the achievement of their long agitated for political independence, the Congolese hardly touched a hair of any white man's head. It was after they got what they wanted that they went berserk and the killing began. And why? Because magic failed them. The word independence had come to have a magical meaning for millions of them. On that day, they believed their personal lives would magically change. Money and cars and big houses and promotions, especially in the army, would all be theirs. And when the days passed and none of this happened, something simply shattered in their breasts. But why does the alleviation of poverty and misery move so very slowly in Latin America? I think the answers are by no means all of an economic and social organizational nature. I think the emotional relationship of the typical Latin American toward other people there is a very special and subtly different thing. That when he does something wrong, he is not overly disposed to feel guilty toward the person he has wronged, but toward himself and toward his God. There seems a greater inwardness to morality there than in our own Anglo-Nordic, predominantly Protestant society. That at least is what I sense about it. And I believe this condition is one of the core reasons why things like the Alliance for Progress move so very slowly. But rarely are these things explained at all in these terms. And another official article of our faith is that there is a direct relationship between mass poverty and the danger of communism. There is, of course, a relationship, but it is not very direct, and certainly not binding. If it were, Cuba, which had one of the highest rates of per capita income in Latin America, would not now be communist. And Portugal, let's say, which has one of the lowest in Europe, would be. Another official concept is that there's a direct relationship between education and democracy. This, too, is only indirect. Argentina has about the highest literacy rate in Latin America and falls repeatedly under military control. It was educated, scientifically advanced Germany, after all, that produced Adolf Hitler. Indeed, the whole official triangulation of peace with progress with democracy, constantly expressed in the speeches of our leaders, this notion that the three are not merely good each in itself, but interdependent. This notion, it seems to me, has rather little warrant in the evidence of the past, though it may be the necessary and the essential framework, philosophically speaking, for the long-distance future. I'm not quite sure about that in my own mind. And I would agree that a country that can develop a middle class as a balance wheel has a better chance for stability or for free institutions. But anybody who thinks that the universal spread of middle-class societies will guarantee peace then has to think again about World War I and the nations that started that one. Another article of our official faith is that consolidation, bigger political and economic units in this world, is a good thing. I would give this argument the benefit of the doubt, but we should not think that there are no doubts. In general, bigger units can have beneficial economic effects, and that's no small thing. They may have cultural benefits. I'm uncertain how much the consolidation process has to do with preserving peace. Certainly, if and when the peace is broken, the collision would apt to be greater because the opposing units are greater, like NATO, for example, in the Warsaw Alliance. NATO very probably did give West Europe the chance to recover, reorganize in the post-war shadow of a powerful and apparently menacing Russia. But it's at least an open question now, a debatable question, whether the European peace could not be organized in a more flexible and realistic manner if the two great formal blocs did not exist. These things are at least debatable, though I must say, would like to see a genuine political federation of West Europe, if that's at all possible, if for nothing else as a kind of third force in this world. The polarization between Russia and the United States seems to me too rigid, too dangerous a thing. Another fundamental assumption is that while the rich nations get richer, the poor get poorer, and that in this widening gap lies great peril for the world. Some of the poor nations are getting poorer, chiefly because of their birth rates, but not all of them. And historically speaking, I don't know what really is new about this great imbalance between peoples and soils and rates of industrialization, except now, I suppose, the speed of the spread. And as to the peril, there may be a higher degree of peril now because modern communications has made us all far more keenly aware of these injustices, we and the intellectuals of the suffering countries. The bitter contrasts of which they are now aware invite more efforts at political upheaval as well as they invite more foreign material aid. But it can involve real world peril only as it involves the great powers. And the great powers have been learning some discouraging lessons in their efforts to line up small and poor countries on their political sides. Otherwise, there's no great peril, I would think, only sadness in the condition of the poor nations, because there are no power centers in Latin America, Africa, or much of Asia. Perhaps it would be fair to say that at the bottom of our official reasoning, there lies the concept of Mr. Rusk and others that freedom is indivisible. This seemed to be obviously and overwhelmingly true in the 30s, the time of the war, and in Stalin's period of post-war expansion. At any rate, I'm sure we had to act as if it were. But if this is an immutable condition of humankind, then our prospects are not very great. It would not take very many rents in that common vessel to drown us all. But both peace and freedom have been divisible, coexisting with war and tyranny through most human history. And surely the world ship of state is designed with a good many protective bulkheads. Now, all these separate but connected official concepts add up, one is tempted to say, to the American ideology. I don't want to press too hard on this point, but I think we have to be a little careful about ideologies, even one so well intended as our own. They do have a way of becoming a curse. They have been part and parcel of what has been called the politics of hysteria, which caught up much of Europe in the 30s and still convulses China and much of Africa. But ideologies have been on a general decline these past few years. They have been losing their force, losing out to simple nationalism and the power of the modern scientific industrial revolution, wherein lie the real secrets of a new order of material life for human beings. We Americans are supposed to be the pragmatic people above all others. We have not believed in history as a great irresistible juggernaut which one must either ride or be crushed by. Communists do believe that. As Jacques Maritain, the French philosopher, has put it, America, he said, has gambled ahead of juggernauts, scorning it, improvising its own historical imperatives, and successfully as it danced along. Let us be a bit careful, lest the articles of faith that grew out of our own very peculiar and fortunate experience on this continent become an official and dogmatic ideology that we try to apply to the rest of mankind. I would think that if we prove not to have the humor or the sense of proportion necessary to avoid messianism, then we will prove to be no wiser than the Chinese, who specifically referred to China and its culture as the middle kingdom between heaven and the ordinary earth, and no wiser than the Slavs, who thought for centuries that Mother Russia was the true source spring for the whole world, no wiser than the Victorian English, who were quite convinced it was their duty to civilize the world, that is, to make it as much like Sussex as possible. We shall have to think a little humbly about this vast power of ours and the ease with which it permits almost anywhere, which makes action easier than hard thought. I think this really is what people like Fulbright have been begging the President to do. I think it is those men who understand this danger, who know what Sophocles was talking about when he said that this law shall forever be true. Nothing that is vast enters into the affairs of mortals without a curse. This power we have is vast. Power in and of itself is neither good nor evil. I suppose it's all but impossible to do much good without power. But power associated with any Messiah complex and justified by a faith that becomes a dogma, uniformly applied to a world that is infinitely varied, that is a dangerous thing. And that kind of curse has come over virtually every nation that acquired great power in the world, and we somehow have to be the exception. I suppose if there's a real silver lining in all the black and ugly clouds of this Vietnam War, it would lie then with a speculative thought that this particular exercise of the philosophy of universalism may have put an end to that philosophy, if not for this administration, then for the next. But why has it been so painfully difficult to conduct a successful foreign policy? I think the underlying reason is fairly obvious. It applies to the other two great powers, Russia and China, as well as it applies to us, because all are floundering, the Chinese most of all. They have managed, no less, to make enemies of both the other two powers and to get themselves completely encircled. The underlying reason is that none of the great powers can any longer identify exactly where its own vital interests lie in the world. And the reason for this is that the measurement is no longer territory as it was in the days of colonial empires. None of today's great powers needs, or I think really wants, foreign real estate. All three happen to be continental powers, and that's a new thing in history. What each tries to acquire beyond its borders is not territory, but influence. And influence is extremely hard to measure, to apply, even to define. So from this fog of uncertainties, a modus vivendi has to emerge, some kind of tacit understanding among the three as to who does not try to do what where. And as between two of the three, the United States and the Soviet Union, this modus vivendi has already taken a rough shape. Between these two, the real Cold War, at least in its virulent form as we knew it, may be over. If it is, then I would think it ended around the time that the United States proved the credibility of its nuclear deterrent in that Cuba Missile Crisis, and the great schism developed between Chinese and Russian communism. So the U.S. and the Soviet Union today stand almost as unacknowledged allies in matters where China is concerned. Russia has indefinitely postponed the idea of trying to subvert West Europe, we long ago abandoned those ideas about liberating East Europe. Russia knows she must make no dramatic moves over Berlin. Europe apparently is to come together again, not by formal agreements between these powers, but by the slow reconciliation processes of trade and travel and life's daily arts. Russia will try nothing dramatic in the Caribbean. Neither of us will try anything dramatic in the Middle East, at least neither wishes to. Neither wishes to have a showdown there between the two. So as between Russia and this country, with Europe as the pivot, a rough balance of power does seem to have been struck. Asia is the problem. The immediate question is whether the United States, by its actions there, has not enlarged the danger beyond what would have otherwise been its normal proportions. And on present evidence, I'm inclined to think that this is just what we've done. It comes down to one's view of communist China, its nature and intentions and capabilities for harm. To me, at any rate, it seemed that China was already contained before we put a single soldier in the soil of continental Asia. Japan to the north was a solid society, impervious to subversion, allied with our power. South Korea was stable, well protected. Taiwan was doing very well. Communists did not dare try to invade her. Indonesia was and is something of a mess, but with an anti-communist and anti-Chinese resiliency that was proved about 3 years ago. Thailand had border troubles, but a strong central regime. Neutrality was serving Burma well. India had our guarantee, and is in any case a country, given its present condition, that no aggressor in his right mind would wish to occupy. And the whole Pacific Ocean, to the very approaches of East Asia, was and is an American lake in terms of sea and air power. And on her western borders, China was contained by some 5,000 miles of Soviet-Russian garrisons and airfields. But to the south, there was what we used to call Indochina, Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, the soft spots. This one area, the scallop on the fringe of vast Asia. And to plug this gap, the United States has sent an enormous army, 10,000 miles away, to fight on the Asian land mass, to bomb within a few miles of the borders of a great hostile and neurotic nation, something we would not tolerate for 24 hours, with the situation reversed, and the Chinese fighting, let's say, in Central America and bombing near the Rio Grande. And what is the rationale for this state of affairs? It's the freedom is indivisible rationale. The idea that if aggression succeeds in one place, it will spread with snowballing effect to other places. It is the test case syndrome, the notion that if the communists discover they can succeed with guerrilla war in Vietnam, their counterparts will go to guerrilla war all around Asia, Africa, and Latin America. But surely local conditions determine what will happen in a given locality far more than examples at a distance. If this test case argument really held up, then the reverse side of its coin also should be valid. I mean that the failures of guerrilla warfare in the Philippines, in Malaysia, ought to have discouraged Ho Chi Minh from trying in Vietnam, but they did not. In any case, if communists around the world are drawing a lesson from what's happened in Vietnam, it's the opposite of the lesson this administration sought to teach them. We are mired, the greatest power in the world. But really the most important lesson of the last decade or so is that nationalism is stronger than communism in the long run. That communism is not a universal, interconnected, centrally manageable force. Through Africa, Latin America, much of Asia, it lies in disarray, a waning and not a waxing tide. In one country after another, the Chinese as well as the Russians have had their fingers badly burned in recent years. In my own horseback opinion, communism remains a danger chiefly in small nations of a special kind, where a few men can seize a presidential palace and a radio station and the army barracks and rule the whole country. Places, for example, like the Dominican Republic. But Mao Zedong's China, economically very weak, barely entering the industrial age, torn with deep internal dissension, is not Hitler's Germany, and Vietnam is not Czechoslovakia. And this historical analogy invoked by Secretary Rusk to justify the necessity of blocking aggression in Southeast Asia, of avoiding so-called appeasement, I think does not fit. I think that the administration has piled an immense weight in men and treasure and maybe even danger of world war on extremely thin intellectual ice. It was not certain that China was going anywhere in the sense of physical military expansion. Not, I would think, into Southeast Asia, poor and crowded as so much of it is. But if she wanted to expand physically, she would surely want to expand into the sparsely settled lands which lie in Siberia, and that in the first instance would be Russia's problem, not ours. We are, I think, badly overextended, not just in terms of our financial resources, but in terms of our trained personnel, our attention span, our fund of worldly wisdom. Our efforts abroad, I think, are out of balance with what ought to be the efforts at home to renovate our own badly maladjusted society. I am not preaching isolationism. I don't hold to the simple faith that by our shining example alone, we're going to lead the rest of mankind toward the good life. I know that pride can precede a fall, but I also know that in these world affairs, purity may precede paralysis. But I think we have got to the point where our reach is exceeding our grasp and where we are doing, in some respects, more harm than good. We face the short-run problem of Vietnam and the long-range problems of foreign policy in general. Of course, it's much easier to raise questions, as I've been doing here, than to provide certain answers. We are in a true dilemma, historically true dilemma in Vietnam. And a pull-out now, a real pull-out, would have much graver consequences than it might have had 2 or 3 years ago. And I feel certain about no single recipe, but my instincts have told me for a long time that we ought to de-escalate this fighting. It is we who must take the risks and gestures toward peace, because we, not Hanoi, I think, have the real surplus power, the flexibility. We have a disciplined army. Perhaps we can stop and restart a war a little more easily than they can. And now, thank God, we are trying to start this process. This is a short-range dilemma. We're involved in many long-range intellectual and moral dilemmas in general foreign policy. If the Congress did nothing else, I would settle for a root and branch re-examination of America's purposes and practices in the world at large. And I think out of this would not come a hopeless cynicism about the world, nor a policy of hermetically sealed isolation. We're not that kind of people. At the minimum, we have too many instincts of both curiosity and generosity toward others. We have done very much abroad to be proud of. We are not going to retire and sulk like a rejected lover. We're not going to abrogate our alliances. But a re-examination could loosen some rigid postures, could teach us to stop worrying so much about Europe, which I think is going to work out its own fate in any case, needs not much else from us beyond the nuclear guarantee. Could teach us that while we can give simple humanitarian help, technical and educational, to the new African states, we must not try to play politics amongst them. Can teach us to regard the troubles of Latin America as chiefly of their own making, not ours. But while we will remain steady in our friendship and aid, we do not expect to renovate their economies in 10 years, as President Kennedy once suggested. We can learn to adjust our sense of time and to understand that what required generations to accomplish in North America and Europe and Japan cannot be accomplished within a few years in today's economically backward lands. We can learn that the values of Asia are not those of New York or Chicago, and that nothing will happen in Asia according to the rules of Western logic. And we can learn, and this surely I think we must learn soon, to scale down our official rhetoric about remaking the world in our own economic and political image, to bring our rhetoric within the bounds of the realities that exist. If we don't, we're going to be believed by no one abroad sooner or later, maybe not even by our own people at home whose common sense has not been entirely eroded. And we can understand that political crises are part of the natural unfolding of history, that merely because instantaneous communications have now put the most remote crisis within our ken, this does not necessarily put it within the realm of our responsibility. We did not make the world, nor did history begin with us. We are an episode in history, remarkable, indeed a unique episode, I hope long-lasting. but not chapter 1 nor the final chapter. And we may learn that the thing we can do most efficiently in this life, to the most lasting and benign effect, is the renovation of our own American society in the direction of justice for its minorities, an opportunity for those afflicted by ignorance and mischance, order, comfort, and cleanliness in our sprawling cities, and areas of serenity and beauty in our once lovely countryside. For the truth is, I think, that America has not yet realized itself. It hasn't yet acquired its own true form and style. We have built a successful nation, but not yet a fully successful society or culture. And if we could do that, I think we would bring to the world the greatest possible gift and blessing, and one within our real powers. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Severide, for this informative, insightful presentation. And now I would like to invite all of you to attend the open house and the receptions to be held in each hall in the LaFollette Hall complex. I'd like to point out that Mrs. LaFollette will be receiving her friends in the reception area in the complex, in the main reception area. Each faculty member and their family will be receiving their friends in the hall named in their honor. Let us adjourn to LaFollette Hall so that we can meet the honored people.